Welcome back to this special edition of NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman. This week, we're talking to the experts about proper animal nutrition during the tough winter months ahead after this year's historic drought. Let's get back to our discussion. Kent, I was going to ask you a question. What happens if your pasture resources are totally exhausted and you're considering dry lotting cows? What is your experience there?
Yeah, dry lotting is an option. The first thing you need to definitely look at is you can put a cow-calf pair in the dry lot, but you're better off splitting the pairs and then just feeding them separate, especially in the dry lot situation. It's going to be easier. You know, back in the 90s in Illinois and Ohio, actually I did some work, and Dr. Lurch at Ohio State had done work on limit feeding cows where you feed only about 0.5% of body weight hay, and then depending on the size of the cow, it could be somewhere with 10 to 12 pounds of corn. Well, that's back when corn was $2 a bushel. Now we're talking $7.50 a bushel, and it's really hard to make that work in the limit feeding side. You can run the pencil and try to see if that'll work in your situation, but most of the time we're talking about using stuff like corn stalks and wheat straw and soybean stubble. You know, fill those cows up, get some energy into them with byproducts, distillers grains, gluten feed, you know, anything that we can get, maybe a little bit of corn, and basically feeding those cows with the poor quality forage, some protein supplement, and getting by. But it will cost, you know, we're looking at about $3 a day. So you need to decide, are we going to be in the cattle business or do we need to move those cows on?
And Dr. Farmer, I was going to ask you, you know, fiber and roughage are not the same thing, and sometimes we can get in as much trouble feeding some of these high fiber products as we can high starch products. Fair enough?
That's exactly right. If you think about what your forage base does for you, your pasture, your hay, it provides a fiber-based energy source, plus it provides that all-important roughage. You say, well, why is roughage important? Roughage provides that scratch factor in the rumen, gives you more rumen motility, causes the cows to salivate more, which helps buffer the rumen. What you're really doing is you're just promoting a healthier rumen environment. If you have a healthy rumen, you're going to have a healthy cow that's going to perform. Some of these higher fiber byproducts like soy hulls, corn gluten feed, and some of these things, they're excellent energy sources and should be used in these situations. But if you don't put some roughage with it, you could really wind up with some acidosis, bloat, scours. And even in a couple of droughts that we've seen in Texas where folks only use these high fiber byproducts and not a roughage source, we actually had some cows that were foundered. So they put all that money into them to get them through the drought, and then they wind up with a cow that they actually have to get rid of at the end. So you got to make sure that just because it's a high fiber feed doesn't mean necessarily it's a really safe feed. You need to make sure you have roughage in that diet as well. So.
Dr. Georges, you were talking about corn before. I've heard about rejected grains. I mean, what are some of the cautions you would offer if we're going to try to feed cattle some grains that have been rejected, and how much of that can we get away with?
Yeah, like we talked earlier, this year aflatoxin is usually the biggest concern because of the drought where the ear was opened up. We got the moisture and the molds grew that produced the aflatoxin. So like we said earlier, with cows, about 20 parts per billion of aflatoxin, and that's the threshold that most of the feed mills, the grain handling facilities do reject the corn. Now, so we need to be cautious with the cows. Now on the feedlot side, we're more fortunate. We can go up to 300 part per billion. So, you know, a lot higher. We can take those grains in, cheapen up some of our rations, and still have a safe feed to feed them. In other cases, you just need to see what you got and try to blend it down.
Very good. And Dr. Farmer, another question to you. What was your advice relative to feeding like baled corn or baled milo stalks rather than hay?
Right. In our part of the world anyway, hay is fed free choice, and typically you put it out and you put a round bale feeder around it. And the way that that's managed is when the hay is just about gone, then you go out and you put more grass hay. Well, if you're having to switch over because you can't get grass hay to corn stalks or milo stubble, you have to realize that if you're sitting there with 2 foot of these stalks that are this long and this big around in the bottom of your hay feeder, that it's probably time to go ahead and put some more forage out, because they're not going to eat that forage. If you decide that you're going to, quote, make them clean it up, then what you wind up with is cows that are hungry for 2 or 3 days, and what that means is less body condition, and then you get into some performance problems. So you have to manage it differently than what you do grass hay. You have to be ready to pull the trigger to put out more forage when they really need it.
And I know we don't have much up in this country, but what about some of our viewers who feed gin trash? What guidance would you give there?
Right. Gin trash is something that we have some of in the South, where we have cotton gins and so forth. And what I would tell you on that is you can use that, but you need to proceed with caution. What I would tell you is to not expect that to be your sole source of nutrition and expect a great outcome. And here's 3 reasons for that. Most of the time that is bought because it's a roughage replacement for your hay or silage or whatever you have, because of the cotton burrs that are left in the gin trash. But there's 3 things nutritionally you got to remember about gin trash that make it less desirable maybe than what it seems up front. The first thing is, when you buy gin trash, 15 to 20% of it's dirt. And so you're right off the bat, it may seem like a good deal, but a lot of it is something you already have plenty of. The second part of that is you're buying it for roughage, but there's a lot of cotton fiber left in gin trash. And because of that, if you just go dump a load out on pasture, and that's going to be their sole source of nutrition, for 3 or 4 days, you may have cows that are actually pretty loose because they're sorting through that really highly digestible fiber that's coming from that cotton. And then what you're left with is the cotton burr, and the only way they'll eat that is if it's kind of mixed with something else or if it's small enough that they can eat it. And so what you were trying to provide is roughage, and at the end of the day, that's the last thing they got out of it. If you're going to use it, it's a lot better to put it in a TMR or total mix ration with other ingredients to provide some energy, because it's low in energy, and then also provide some true roughage that helps continue to make rumen health as optimal as we can get it. So you can use it, but don't expect it to be the be-all end-all for your nutrition program.
Very good. And Dr. Tijardis, a question back to you. As you think about some of the complete feeds and the hay in our country costing $200+ a ton, what are the complete feed options that would rival that $200 a ton target?
The challenge is anytime hay gets driven up, a lot of, like the summer when we saw the severe drought, a lot of these byproducts that are fiber-based byproducts also go up. We saw soy hulls and wheat midds, they were up over 300 because they're primarily used for cake and creep feeds. Distillers went up over 300 for the energy in that. So it gets challenging for us to make a complete feed that's going to rival that. Most of the time we're looking at trying to improve the efficiency of using the other feeds on that situation. But the biggest thing I always tell people is also look at the forages. When we're going to spend $200 on hay, let's make sure we're not wasting it. That's the biggest concern I have with producers is they'll just unroll the bale, or they'll use those old hay wagons. That could lose 50%. So now we talk, you got $200 hay that became $300 hay. So look into, using hay busters or TMR mixes, or even going and buying those newer hay feeders that have the, they hold the hay up and it's got a hay saver around the outside. So we only get about 20% waste instead of 50% waste. And maybe we can get down even further than that and save some cost.
I'd like to follow up on that with you, Dr. Farmer. What other suggestions would you give us relative to stretching some of our roughage?
Right. It's important to make sure that you understand how much you need to get through this drought spell from point A to point B. And once you figure that out, if you say, wow, I don't have but about half the hay I need, it's really imperative that you switch to a program that allows you to use half as much of that hay and still get your nutrient requirements met. A way to safely and economically do that is to use something that helps limit the intake of a TMR or something like that. Our AccuRation program helps to limit the intake of a higher concentrate feed that would normally be very dangerous to feed by itself, but we're able to get away with more grain in the cattle, and we can cut back on the amount of energy they have to get from your roughage sources, which is in short supply. So it's important to make sure that you know how much you have, how much you need, and then you can find some of these programs like the AccuRation program to help extend what you have. Our AccuRation Forage Extender program has helped us a lot in Texas get at that. So,
Dr. Patterson, we've talked a lot about the importance of supplements, but what happens when we find that our cows are eating too much supplement?
Well, I've run into this often, and what I suspect is going on, they've run out of forage out there. They're out of groceries, and so the only thing that's available to them is a supplement, and they're going to overconsume on that. So it looks to me, Kevin, you've only got 2 choices. Either you got to get them out of that pasture and get them onto a pasture that's got more forage, or you got to take them to dry lot, or you got to get rid of some cows, because you're out of balance on that. I think a lot of that overconsumption is due that they've just run out of an energy feed stuff out there.
Yeah. Dr. Farmer, I want to come back to you. I say this with hesitation. I'm hopeful that you're a year out of the worst part of your drought. Let's just make that assumption. So I'm interested in what we can learn. What are some of the implications? What are some of the key learnings as you reflect back now a year later on what some of us have just gone through this last summer?
Right. Well, I would like to kind of just reiterate the point that Dr. Patterson just made. You know pretty quick on particular self-fed supplement, you've got a forage quantity issue when their intake really goes up on that supplement. And so the way that we've gotten at that on some of these ranches that have, unfortunately in South Texas, for instance, we've had a drought every other year for the last 10 years. And so the way they've gotten at that is a lot of those folks have half as many cows as they had a decade ago. But a lot of those places are also weaning about the same number of pounds off that place as they did before. They're just taking the good years and stockpiling some of that grass, and they're able to maintain their supplementation program, which is a lower cost program than putting them in a dry lot and feeding them everything they get, or taking them to town and selling them because we can't afford that. So really the best long-term plan is to really watch that stocking rate and pull it back to where it really needs to be, to where you have stockpiled forage in your pasture that you can utilize in those years that are really tough from a precipitation standpoint.
Yeah, that's good advice. Kerry, I'd be interested in your perspective. What do you see as some of the longer-term implications of this drought that we're experiencing?
I think the big thing for the stocker and feed yard is we probably prolong the cattle expansion for another year, I suppose. And I'd like to think when we get done killing these cows, all these cows, both in the dairy industry and the beef industry, that the calf market's going to get really good and the beef prices are going to get really good at some point. So, I mean, I'm concerned about keeping the feed yard, all the feed yards, and we've got overcapacity in the cattle feeding side of it as well as the packing side. So I hope that they survive and get through till we get the cow numbers back up. So
I also want to follow up. You'd mentioned something during break that it's fundamentally changing what kind of cattle you're buying, the weights of those cattle, and even when you're buying it. Tell us a little bit about those impacts.
Well, we started procuring calves probably a month or two early just because they were there, which they typically didn't happen until the usual fall runs, at least for us. We're buying lighter calves probably because there's not as much competition for those cattle going to wheat pasture because it isn't there. We're trying to buy lighter calves to get as far away from these high cost of gains as we can and get some of those into 2013 corn. So those are some changes that we've made, I guess, on our operation.
And John, you know, there's been a lot of good information shared already here today, but what do you say to viewers who say, hey, you've answered some of my questions, I still have a lot of other questions I want to ask. What other resources would you point them towards?
If there's ever a time to not be shy, it's right now. You got to reach out and get a hold of some guys. Like these three right here are excellent resources for you. State beef cattle extension specialists, the local county agent, the local veterinarian. And listen to these guys have just a light went on. Man, I got to go talk to an equipment guy. If I'm going to have to use wheat straw, they're not going to eat it in a big bale. Maybe I need to invest in a forage chopper or something to chop it, and I might have to invest in some bunks where I can put a chopped forage, because we know if we chop it, increase intake 20%. That's the energy going into that cow. So yeah, lots of resources out there. Don't be shy. Call them up and ask their help.
Well, gentlemen, I'd like to have a couple of you weigh in on this next question about the economics. I mean, as people begin pushing their pencils and saying, how do I get from now to that time that Kerry was talking about, maybe 6, 8, 9 months from now that we anticipate some great cattle prices, what guidance chance would you give people as they start crunching those numbers?
Yeah, it really is a situation where you have to decide up front, am I in or am I out? And what I mean by that is it may cost you $3 per cow per day to get that dry cow from point A to point B. And so what you have to do is be very real with yourself and say, hey, can I afford to do that on all my cows for this extended period of time? If you can't, then you need to sell the cows that you can't afford to feed. Because the last thing you want to do is decide, okay, I can't afford to spend $3 a day on my cows, so I'm only going to spend $2 or maybe $1.50. And then all your cows get skinny and you have that 50% breed up. Now you just paid for that 50% breed up over that time frame. That's the last place you want to be. You want to make sure up front you can afford to do it. If you can't, go ahead and sell the cows. It's not a bad thing to do that. It's better to have that money in the bank than to spend all that money to get a skinny cow at the end of the day.
That's good advice. Kent, what would you add?
Well, this year was one of the years where, you know, we had a lot of calves that were weaned earlier, and most people are used to those, you know, 500, maybe even 600-pound weaning weights.
Sure.
A lot of guys, they decided to try to background. They looked at it, put a pencil to it, you know, looked at some of our complete programs like Impact Background or Impact Grower, where you didn't have to have any roughage, but you could just self-feed. Now, of course, dollars per ton, it looks expensive, but when you're putting 4 pounds of gain and being really efficient with these young lightweight calves and taking these 3 weights up to 5, they found, real economic to that, because you're, doing it for maybe $1 or less per pound of gain, and you're selling it for $1.40 or more. So that's another area that guys are looking at, is they've never background before, and they're looking at other opportunities.
So considering new ways and new management practices, really thinking differently about your operation. Kerry, you get to do this every day. What guidance would you give us from an economic standpoint?
An old rancher told me one time, you better run out of cattle before you run out of feed. So I tried to look at that now from the feedlot and stocker operation, that we got to plan a lot further ahead than we had to in the past as far as all our protein and energy sources.
That's great. Guys, this is great advice, and I really appreciate your willingness to share it. We'll have final thoughts from our panelists right after this. Stay with us.